The first lie Raymond Dalton told his children came 3 days after his wife's memorial service. "The farm's gone," he said quietly over the phone. Most of it, anyway. Outside the trailer window, wind moved through the dead corn stalks in long gray waves. Somewhere beyond the north pasture, a loose piece of tin knocked softly against the side of the old equipment shed. Raymond listened to the silence on the other end of the line. Then Marcus finally asked, "How bad is it?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" "How bad is it?" Raymond closed his eyes. In the farmhouse kitchen 50 yards away, the porch light still burned every night at sunset. Eileen used to say a dark porch looked like a lonely house. So even now, after a year without her, Raymond still switched the light on before dusk. Old habits survived longer than people. "I made mistakes," he said. That part, at least, was true. Another silence. Then Marcus asked the question Raymond had already expected. "What about the land?" The wind hit the trailer again. Raymond looked down at the folded letter resting beside his coffee cup. Eileen's handwriting stared back at him from the paper. A man should know whether his children love him or only what he can leave behind. He ended the call a minute later. Then the next phone rang. Diane. By the time the fourth call ended, Raymond felt 20 years older than he had that morning. Not one of them had asked if the trailer had heat. Only Nora asked that. His youngest. "Dad," she said softly before hanging up. "Did you eat anything today?" That question stayed with him long after dark. The trailer smelled faintly of rust, old wood, and the dust of summers that had passed through it decades ago. Raymond sat at the small table beneath the narrow window and rubbed both hands together slowly. The arthritis had been worse since winter started coming early. Eileen used to warm his gloves in the dryer before sunrise. Funny what a man misses. Not the big moments. The small ones. The second cup on the counter. The sound of someone humming in another room. The way another person changes the silence inside a house. Raymond looked again at the letter. He had found it 4 nights earlier, tucked inside Eileen's old garden journal after the memorial dinner. That dinner had changed something in him. 4 children sitting around the same table where they once fought over mashed potatoes and Christmas pie. 4 adults, now discussing trust structures, grain contracts, land values, and inheritance before the roast beef had even gone cold. Eileen's chair sat empty at the end of the table. Nobody looked at it. Nobody except Raymond. And later that night, after everyone left, he found the journal. Then the brass key taped inside it. Then the note. North trailer drawer. He had almost laughed when he saw it. The old trailer had not mattered in years. Seasonal workers used it back in the 90s during harvest season, but after that it slowly became another forgotten thing on the Dalton property. Apparently, Eileen had not forgotten it. Inside the drawer beneath the trailer table, Raymond found the metal box. Inside the metal box were trust documents, account numbers, property records, and another sealed letter with his name written carefully across the front. "Ray, if you are reading this, then you finally see what I saw years ago. Do not punish them, but find out the truth. Find out who comes back when there is nothing left to gain." Raymond had read the letter 3 times before sunrise. Then he called Frank Myers, the family attorney. By afternoon, every major asset Raymond owned had been quietly transferred into a protected trust Eileen created years earlier, without the children knowing. The farm was safe. The grain elevators were safe. The accounts were safe. Only Raymond's reputation was about to disappear. And strangely enough, sitting alone in the trailer now, that part hurt more than he expected. Outside, headlights appeared briefly through the trees. Raymond stiffened. A pickup truck moved slowly down the gravel lane toward the trailer, tires crunching softly over frozen dirt. For one foolish second, his chest tightened with hope. Marcus drove a Ford. Kevin did too. Maybe one of them had come back. Maybe one of them had realized something after the calls. The truck stopped outside. An engine idled. Raymond stood carefully, one hand against the table for balance. His knees cracked as he crossed the narrow trailer floor toward the window. The porch light outside flickered weakly against the dark. Then the driver's door opened. Not Marcus. Not Kevin. Nora stepped out carrying 2 grocery bags against her chest. For a long moment, Raymond simply stood there staring through the glass. Nora looked tired. Her hair was tied back carelessly, and she still wore her diner uniform beneath a winter coat that looked too thin for the weather. But she had come. She looked toward the farmhouse first, then toward the trailer. Then she picked up the bags again and started walking through the cold. Inside one of the grocery bags, Raymond could see the corner of a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs. Nothing expensive. Just enough food for a man living alone in a trailer. Raymond felt something painful move quietly through his chest. Not grief. Not yet relief either. Something smaller. More dangerous. Hope. Then his eyes dropped to the second grocery bag. Resting beside the milk carton was an old brass lock. The exact same kind of lock that matched Eileen's key. The trailer was colder than Raymond remembered. Not just the temperature. The kind of cold that settled into metal walls and stayed there for years. The kind that made a man aware of every draft, every loose seam around a window, every place time had quietly worn something thin. Raymond woke before sunrise with his coat still on. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. Then he heard the soft rattle of the trailer windows in the wind and remembered everything at once. Eileen gone. The farmhouse dark across the pasture. The lie he had told his children. And Nora's truck parked outside. Raymond sat up slowly, one hand pressed against his lower back until the stiffness eased enough for him to stand. The trailer floor creaked beneath his boots. Somewhere inside the walls, old pipes clicked softly. He reached for the small electric heater beside the bed. Dead. The trailer had lost power sometime during the night. "Of course you did," he muttered quietly. Eileen used to laugh whenever something broke at the exact wrong moment. "Well," she would say, "machines have timing too." Funny how a voice could stay alive inside a man's head long after the person was gone. Raymond pulled open the trailer door. Morning fog sat low across the fields. Frost silvered the weeds around the steps. Beyond the pasture, the farmhouse porch light still glowed faintly in the gray dawn, and beside the trailer sat Nora's truck. For a moment, Raymond simply stared at it. She had stayed. He found her asleep in the driver's seat beneath an old blanket. One hand tucked beneath her cheek. A paper diner cup rested empty beside her. Raymond frowned. The trailer only had one usable bed. Last night he had assumed she drove home after bringing groceries. Instead, she spent the night outside in 34-degree weather. Carefully, Raymond knocked once against the window. Nora woke immediately. For one panicked second, she looked 12 years old again. Then she saw him and relaxed. "You should have woken me," Raymond said. Nora pushed hair away from her face. "You needed the bed more. The truck heater work?" Mostly. Raymond looked away toward the fields. His children had grown up in that farmhouse with hot meals, winter coats, Christmas presents, college funds, and parents who never let the power shut off once. And now his youngest daughter slept in a pickup truck because she thought her father might freeze alone in a trailer. Something about that sat heavily in his chest. Nora stepped out of the truck and rubbed her hands together against the cold. "You look awful," she said gently. Raymond snorted. "Good morning to you too." That earned the smallest smile from her. Not a cheerful smile. Just a tired one. The kind people carried after funerals. Inside the grocery bags from last night, Nora unpacked eggs, bacon, bread, coffee, canned soup, and a thick wool blanket Raymond recognized immediately. Eileen's blanket. The blue one from the farmhouse couch. "You took this?" Raymond asked. Nora shrugged. "Mom hated when you were cold." For a second, neither of them spoke. The trailer suddenly felt very small. Raymond busied himself with lighting the old propane stove, while Nora wiped dust from the counter with paper towels she had brought from home. Neither acknowledged how naturally they moved around each other, like people who had done quiet work together before. Outside, wind brushed softly against the trailer walls. Inside, bacon crackled in an old cast-iron pan. Raymond realized it was the first real breakfast he had eaten in days. Not because he lacked food, because grief made simple things feel unnecessary. Nora poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs she found in the cabinet. "You should come back to the house," she said carefully. Raymond kept his eyes on the stove. "Can't afford the heating bill." The lie sounded smaller this morning. "More fragile." Nora stirred sugar into her coffee, but did not answer immediately. Finally, she said, "Marcus called me last night." Raymond waited. "He thinks you should sell before winter." There it was again. Sell. Not. How do we help? Not. What do you need? Sell. Raymond sat down heavily at the little table beneath the window. Steam rose from the coffee between them. "When your mother was alive," he said quietly, "this place used to be full every Thanksgiving." Nora smiled faintly. "Kevin burned the rolls one year. He blamed the oven for 10 straight years. He still does. For the first time that morning, Raymond laughed softly. Only a breath of one, but real. The sound surprised both of them. Then Nora noticed something near the sink. "The lock," she said. Raymond followed her eyes. The brass lock from the grocery bag rested beside the folded letter from Eileen. "You never told me where you found that," he said. Nora hesitated. "I didn't. You brought it here for a reason." She looked down at her coffee. "Mom gave it to me before she died." Raymond went still. The wind outside suddenly sounded louder. Nora reached carefully into her coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a faded dish towel. Another key. Brass. Old. Almost identical to Raymond's. "She told me not to give this to you unless—" Nora stopped herself. "Unless what?" Nora looked toward the farmhouse across the field. "Unless you finally saw people clearly." Raymond stared at the key in her hand. Eileen had planned this. Not just the letter. Not just the trailer. All of it. The realization moved slowly through him like cold water. For years, maybe longer, Eileen had known this moment would come. And somehow, Nora had known part of it too. Raymond looked again at the second brass key, then at his daughter, then back toward the farmhouse, standing silent beyond the frost-covered pasture. "What does it open?" he asked quietly. Nora swallowed. The barn. The barn sat at the far edge of the property, beyond the machine shed and the old grain bins, where the wind always seemed stronger. Raymond had not opened it in almost 18 months. Not since the week after Eileen's funeral. The red paint had faded toward brown over the years, and one side of the roof dipped slightly lower than the other. Frost clung to the boards in pale streaks beneath the morning sun. Nora stood beside him with both hands inside her coat pockets. "You really didn't know?" she asked quietly. Raymond looked at the brass key in his palm. No, that part still unsettled him. Eileen had hidden things from him. Not out of cruelty, out of preparation, and somehow that hurt more. Raymond climbed the barn steps slowly. His knees complained halfway up, and he paused near the top long enough to catch his breath before sliding the brass key into the lock. The metal resisted at first, then turned. A hard click echoed inside the old wood structure. For a second, neither of them moved. The wind rattled the loose chain hanging beside the door. Then Raymond pulled it open. Dust drifted through cold beams of sunlight. The smell hit him first. Motor oil, old wood, high, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, Eileen's lavender soap. Raymond stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. The barn should have smelled abandoned. Instead, it smelled remembered. Nora stepped in behind him carefully. "What is all this?" Raymond did not answer immediately, because he was asking himself the same question. The inside of the barn looked nothing like he remembered. Someone had cleaned it. Recently. Workbenches lined one wall beneath hanging tools organized with impossible neatness. Old tractor parts sat arranged in labeled bins. Shelves held bolts, wiring, oil cans, manuals, and neatly folded shop towels. At the center of the barn sat a Farmall tractor Raymond had not seen running since 2009. Its hood gleamed beneath a layer of dust. Eileen's doing. It had to be. Only she organized things like this. Raymond moved slowly toward the tractor, fingertips brushing along the metal hood. A memory surfaced immediately. Eileen sitting on an overturned bucket 30 years earlier, reading instructions aloud while Raymond rebuilt the transmission during a snowstorm. "You missed a bolt, Ray." "No, I didn't." Second tray on the left. He had missed the bolt. Every time. A small smile touched his face before fading again. Nora wandered toward the workbench. "There's paperwork here." Raymond looked over. Folders sat stacked neatly beneath a green banker's lamp. On top rested another note in Eileen's handwriting. "For Ray when you're ready." Raymond picked it up slowly. Inside was a single page. "Ray, you always said a man can tell who someone really is by how they treat broken things. So, I left you a few." He frowned slightly, then looked around again. Broken things. The old tractor. The barn. The trailer. Maybe even him. Below the note sat 3 repair invoices from families Raymond recognized immediately. Miller, Peterson, Ruiz. All local farmers, all struggling, and all marked, paid in full. But Raymond knew they had never paid him. "What is this?" Nora asked softly. Raymond kept reading. More invoices. More repairs. More names. Some were dated after Eileen's diagnosis. Some after chemotherapy started. Some only months before she died. His chest tightened. "She was bringing people here," he murmured. Nora looked confused. Mom? She knew folks were hurting after the drought. Raymond remembered small things suddenly. Eileen leaving the house early. Extra coffee in thermoses. Grease stains on towels. Late-night phone calls she always took outside. At the time, he assumed she was helping church families organize meals or hospital visits. Instead, she was sending them here, Raymond whispered. Nora stared at him. You fixed these tractors? I don't remember half of them, but slowly he did. Bits and pieces. A transmission rebuild for a widower with no insurance. A combine repair done overnight before harvest. A fuel pump replacement he never charged for because the man's wife was sick. Eileen had kept records of all of it. Not money records, people records. Beside each invoice, she wrote notes. Lost his wife in March. Daughter fighting leukemia. Too proud to ask for help. Brought pie afterward. Prays for you every Sunday. Raymond sat down heavily on the old stool near the workbench. For years he thought Eileen spent her time preserving the family, but maybe she had spent it preserving him. Outside, wind pushed softly against the barn walls. Nora picked up another folder. Dad? Her voice changed. Raymond looked up. Inside the folder were photographs. Dozens of them. Farmers beside repaired tractors. Families standing in front of combines. Children holding toolboxes. One photo showed Raymond laughing beside a teenager holding jumper cables. He barely remembered the moment, but Eileen had saved it. Every one of them. There was even a handwritten title across the folder tab. The Things Ray Fixed. Raymond looked away quickly. Grief worked strangely. Sometimes, a man survived the funeral just fine, only to nearly break because of handwriting on a file folder. Nora sat beside him quietly. She knew you'd need this someday, she said. Raymond nodded once, but something else bothered him now. He looked around the barn again, slower this time. Tools cleaned recently. Dust disturbed near the shelves. Fresh oil smell beneath the older scents. Someone had been inside here after Eileen died. And not long ago, Raymond stood carefully and walked toward the back wall. Near the tool cabinet, fresh boot prints marked the concrete dust. Large boots. Not Nora's. Not his. He crouched slowly despite the pain in his knees. The print overlapped another. Someone had come here more than once. Nora saw it too. You think Marcus found this place? Raymond shook his head slowly. No. Kevin. Another pause. Then Raymond looked toward the far corner of the barn where an old canvas tarp hung from ceiling hooks. Something large sat beneath it. Rectangular. Too clean around the edges. Recently uncovered. The cold inside the barn suddenly felt different. Not abandoned. Occupied. Raymond stepped toward the tarp carefully, then stopped. Because outside, somewhere beyond the barn doors, tires crunched slowly across frozen gravel. Someone was coming up the farm road. And whoever it was already knew exactly where to find them. The truck outside the barn belonged to Harold Jensen. Raymond recognized the faded green pickup before the engine even shut off. Harold climbed out slowly, pulling his cap lower against the wind. At 76, he moved like a man whose body argued with him every morning, but lost anyway. Well, Harold called toward the barn, either somebody's stealing your tools, or you finally opened the place. Raymond let out a quiet breath. For a moment, he had expected someone else. Someone less welcome. You drive all the way out here just to complain? Raymond asked. Harold grunted. Brought extension cords. He lifted a coil of orange cable from the truck bed. And coffee. That explains it, Raymond said. You've never done anything generous without caffeine involved. Nora laughed softly beside him. The sound changed the atmosphere inside the barn immediately. Small sounds mattered now. Raymond noticed that too. By mid-morning, the three of them had the barn doors fully open. Pale autumn sunlight stretched across the concrete floor, while Harold worked on reconnecting temporary power from the nearby shed. Nora cleaned shelves with old shop towels. Raymond stood beside the Farmall tractor, with both hands resting on the hood. The old machine looked tired. Not ruined, just forgotten. A little like him. You thinking about trying it? Harold asked. Raymond nodded once. She hasn't turned over in 15 years. Harold smirked. So basically brand new by your standards. That earned another small laugh from Nora. Again, Raymond felt the strange warmth that came from hearing life return to empty spaces. The barn had been silent too long. Raymond lifted the hood carefully. Dust coated the engine, but not evenly. Someone had cleaned parts of it recently. Not a full restoration. Maintenance. Oil checked. Battery replaced. Fuel lines inspected. His eyes narrowed slightly. Eileen could organize a church fundraiser with 3 phone calls and half a pie, but she could not rebuild a carburetor, which meant someone else had helped her. Or someone was still helping now. Dad? Nora handed him a clean wrench without needing to ask which one. Raymond looked at her briefly. You remember. You taught me. No pride in her voice. Just fact. That hurt him in ways he did not fully understand yet. Because she was right. He had taught her once. Before life became busy. Before work became easier than conversation. Before money replaced presence. The realization lingered while he worked. Raymond loosened the fuel cap, checked the lines, adjusted the choke, and carefully primed the engine. His hands still remembered everything, even stiff with arthritis, even slower than before. Muscle memory lived deeper than grief. Harold leaned against the workbench, sipping coffee while Nora held the flashlight steady. Outside, the wind carried the dry smell of harvested fields across the property. Finally, Raymond climbed onto the tractor seat. The leather cracked beneath his weight. For 1 second, an old memory hit him so clearly it almost stole his breath. Eileen sitting on the fence rail nearby with a thermos in her lap, watching him work. Always watching. Not because she cared about engines, because she cared about him. Raymond swallowed hard and turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, then died. Harold shrugged. Closer than I expected. Raymond adjusted the choke again. Second try. Another cough. A rough sputter. Then silence. Nora looked at him carefully, probably worried he would take it harder than he did. But strangely enough, Raymond smiled. Not because the tractor failed, because it almost didn't. Fuel's reaching the cylinders now, he said quietly. Hope sounded dangerous inside the barn, like something fragile enough to scare away. On the third attempt, the old farmall finally roared awake. Not smoothly, not beautifully. The engine shook hard enough to rattle loose dust from the rafters. But it ran. Harold burst out laughing first. Nora covered her mouth in surprise. And Raymond. Raymond sat frozen behind the wheel while the engine trembled beneath him like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. The sound filled the barn. Metal. Smoke. Life. For the first time since Eileen died, something inside Raymond moved that was not grief. Purpose. Outside, a flock of birds lifted suddenly from the trees beside the pasture. The old tractor continued rumbling unevenly while blue-gray smoke curled upward through the sunlight. Harold slapped the side panel proudly. Still got some fight left. Raymond rested one hand against the steering wheel. So do I. The words came out before he could stop them. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that settles naturally between people who understand something important without needing to explain it. Nora turned away quickly after that, but Raymond still noticed her wiping at her eyes. Later that afternoon, they cleaned nearly half the barn. More discoveries surfaced with every shelf they organized. Invoices, photos, repair notes in Eileen's handwriting. A ledger showing dozens of repairs done free of charge during drought years. But one thing bothered Raymond more the longer he looked through the files. Several recent pages contained initials he did not recognize. Did. M. Always beside repair dates from the past 6 months. Who's TM? Nora asked. Raymond shook his head slowly. No idea. But someone had clearly been helping maintain the barn after Eileen passed away. Someone trusted enough to work alone on the property. Near sunset, Harold finally restored power to half the overhead lights. The barn glowed warm for the first time in years. Golden light spilled across old tools, workbenches, and tractor parts, while dusk settled blue over the fields outside. The place no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Raymond stood quietly near the doors, watching Nora tape fresh plastic over a cracked window to block the coming winter wind. The movement reminded him painfully of Eileen. Same careful hands, same quiet determination, the same habit of fixing things without announcing it. Then Harold called from the back corner. Ray. Something in his voice changed the room immediately. Not fear. Concern. Raymond walked toward him slowly. Harold stood beside the tarp-covered object near the rear wall. The one Raymond noticed earlier. Only now, the tarp had partially slipped aside. Beneath it sat not machinery, but a large steel filing cabinet, locked, 3 drawers tall, dusty except for the handle. Someone had opened it recently, and attached to the top drawer with yellow tape was another note in Eileen's handwriting. Not until Christmas. Raymond stared at the words. then at the cabinet, then slowly at Nora. But Nora already looked just as confused as he was, which meant whatever waited inside, Eileen had hidden it from both of them. The first snow came early that year. Not much. Just enough to soften the fields and turn the gravel road pale beneath the morning light. Raymond noticed it while carrying firewood from Harold's truck into the trailer. His shoulders hurt afterward, and he had to stop halfway up the steps to catch his breath without letting Nora see it. Aging was a private negotiation between a man and the things he no longer admitted aloud. Inside, the trailer smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust now. Not loneliness. Not entirely. Nora had started coming every morning before work at the diner. Sometimes she brought groceries. Sometimes she brought old blankets or extension cords or tools she claimed were just lying around, but Raymond noticed she always took something away too. Empty cans, dirty towels, broken hinges, things needing repair. As if she understood he needed usefulness almost as much as oxygen. That morning, while Raymond stacked firewood beside the heater, Nora sat at the small table sorting through another box from the barn. Most of it contained receipts and repair invoices. Then she stopped. "What's this?" Raymond looked over. In her hands rested a faded white envelope with his name written across the front in blue ink. Not Eileen's handwriting. His own. He frowned slightly. "Where'd you find that?" "Inside one of the desk drawers." Raymond took the envelope carefully. The paper felt thin with age. 15 years old at least. Maybe more. Then memory returned all at once. "Oh," he murmured quietly. Nora waited. Raymond turned the envelope over slowly before speaking again. "There was a winter," he said, "back around 2008, maybe 2009. Bad year for crops, worse for prices." Outside, snow drifted softly against the trailer windows while his voice settled deeper into the past. "We almost lost the south field." Nora looked surprised. "You never told us that." Raymond gave a tired smile. "Your mother made sure you didn't know." He sat down heavily at the table. For a moment, he only stared at the envelope, then finally opened it. Inside were overdue payment notices, mortgage extensions, equipment loan warnings, medical bills from before insurance approved one of Nora's surgeries as a child, and one handwritten note folded between them all. "Ray, I hid these because the children still laugh in this house. Let them stay children a little longer. We'll survive this too. Love, A." Raymond stopped reading. Outside, wind brushed snow against the trailer, sighting in soft waves. Nora looked down at the papers quietly. "You were really that close?" Raymond nodded once. The bank wanted part of the land. He remembered that winter clearly now. The furnace breaking twice in 1 month. The combine transmission failing during harvest. Marcus needing tuition money. Kevin breaking his wrist. Diane's car accident. Nora's hospital bills. Everything arriving at once like weather. And through all of it, Eileen somehow kept the house warm enough that the children never understood how close things came to collapsing. Raymond leaned back slowly. "I used to think surviving meant providing," he said. Nora stayed quiet. "That's what my father believed too. You work. You pay bills. You keep roofs standing." He rubbed tired fingers against the edge of the envelope. "I figured if the family was fed, then I was doing my job." "And Mom?" Raymond smiled faintly. "Your mother thought surviving meant keeping people soft enough to still love each other afterward." The trailer grew still, the kind of stillness that follows truth. Nora looked toward the frost-covered window. "She knew you better than anybody." "No," Raymond said softly. "She knew what I was missing better than anybody." That realization hurt worse these days. Not because Raymond had failed as a father, because he had mistaken usefulness for closeness for so many years. Money was easier than conversation. Work was easier than vulnerability. Fixing tractors was easier than sitting at the dinner table after a hard day and asking someone how they were really doing. The old heater rattled loudly for a moment before settling again. Raymond folded the papers carefully back into the envelope. Then something slipped loose from inside and landed on the table. A photograph. Nora picked it up first. It showed Raymond standing beside a teenage boy near the barn workshop. Neither of them recognized the boy immediately. Then Nora looked closer. "Wait," she said quietly. "That's Tommy Miller." Raymond stared. She was right. Tommy Miller at 16. Skinny kid. Nervous smile. Standing proudly beside an old tractor engine, memory returned slowly. "His father lost the farm after the drought," Raymond murmured. Nora turned the photo over. On the back, In Eileen's handwriting were 4 words. You fixed more people. Raymond looked away quickly, because suddenly he remembered Tommy showing up at the barn every Saturday that winter after his father started drinking heavily. The kid barely spoke at first, just watched Raymond rebuild engines. Then, eventually started helping. Eventually started smiling. Eventually stopped looking afraid all the time. Raymond had forgotten all of that. Eileen hat not. Nora set the photograph down carefully. How many people did Mom help through you? Raymond almost answered immediately, then stopped, because for the first time, he honestly did not know. That thought stayed with him through the rest of the afternoon, while he repaired a broken cabinet hinge, while Nora made soup on the propane stove, while snow covered the pasture outside in slow white layers. And later that night, after Nora finally drove back into town, Raymond sat alone beneath the dim trailer light with the photograph still resting beside his coffee cup. The barn files, the invoices, the photos, the records. The hidden cabinet marked "Not Until Christmas." Eileen had spent years preserving something. Not money, not land. Something larger, something tied to people. Raymond looked toward the barn through the frosted trailer window. Then he noticed something strange. Light, very faint, but unmistakable. A warm yellow glow flickering briefly behind the barn windows. Raymond sat up immediately. The barn should have been dark. Nora had already gone home. Harold never came after sunset. Slowly, Raymond reached for his coat hanging beside the trailer door. Then for the flashlight near the heater. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the property, and somewhere inside the barn, someone had just turned on the lights. By the time Raymond reached the barn, the light was gone. Snow drifted steadily across the pasture, thin and quiet beneath the beam of his flashlight. His boots crunched over frozen ground while cold air burned deep in his lungs. The barn doors stood closed exactly as he left them. No truck. No footprints fresh enough to catch immediately in the dark. Still, Raymond knew what he saw. Someone had been inside. He pulled one door open carefully. The smell of cold metal and old oil rolled out to meet him. The overhead lights remained off now, but his flashlight beam moved slowly across the workbenches, the tractor, the shelves, and finally toward the tarp-covered filing cabinet at the back wall. Nothing looked disturbed, at least not at first. Then Raymond noticed the workbench. One of the photographs from earlier was missing. Not random paperwork. Not invoices. A photograph. Someone had chosen it. Raymond stood still for several seconds listening to the barn settle around him. Wind rattled faintly through gaps in the siding. Somewhere high above, snow slid from part of the roof with a dull thump. But underneath those ordinary sounds, something else stayed with him. A feeling. Not danger exactly. Recognition. Whoever entered the barn had known where to look. The next morning, Raymond said nothing to Nora. Not yet. Instead, he spent most of the day repairing wiring along the barn wall while snow melted slowly from the pasture outside. The work helped. Not physically. His shoulders ached by noon, and his right hand cramped badly enough that he dropped a screwdriver twice. But work quieted his thoughts, at least temporarily. Nora noticed the pain anyway. You should rest your hand, she said while organizing hardware bins nearby. Raymond grunted. Hands rust faster when they sit still. That doesn't even make sense. It does if you're 74. Nora smiled faintly but did not argue further. Around midday, another truck rolled onto the property. This one Raymond recognized immediately too. Black SUV. County plates. Harold, standing near the barn entrance, muttered under his breath. Well, he said, nothing good ever arrives in one of those. The SUV stopped beside the farmhouse. A man stepped out wearing a charcoal coat and polished boots completely unsuited for Iowa winter mud. Daniel Mercer, Regional Development Manager for Heartland Ag Expansion Group. Raymond knew the name before he ever met the man. Everyone in 3 counties did. Mercer bought struggling farmland, old grain systems, abandoned properties, and family businesses too small to survive corporate farming pressure. He smiled constantly, which somehow made him less trustworthy. Mercer approached with careful confidence, brushing snow from his sleeves. Mr. Dalton, he said warmly, sorry to arrive unannounced. Raymond did not offer a handshake. What do you need? Mercer glanced briefly toward the barn before answering. I heard about the financial situation. Of course he did. Small towns leaked information faster than roofs. Mercer continued gently. I believe there may be an opportunity here that helps everyone. Harold snorted loudly behind Raymond. Mercer ignored him professionally. We're expanding storage operations west of Route 18. Your north acreage sits in a useful position geographically. Raymond already knew where this was going. The land's not for sale. Mercer smiled again. Everything becomes available eventually. Nora crossed her arms nearby but remained silent. Mercer removed a folder from beneath his coat. I understand you're under pressure, he said carefully. Taxes, debt restructuring, asset liquidation. These things become overwhelming alone. Raymond's expression hardened slightly. Interesting. Mercer knew too much already. The fake bankruptcy story had only circulated for days. Yet somehow this man arrived carrying details. Mercer opened the folder. Inside sat a printed purchase proposal. Large numbers. More money than most families in the county would ever see at once. Enough to retire comfortably, Mercer said. Enough to avoid spending winter in a trailer. Harold took one look at the paperwork and laughed sharply. Boy, he said, you people really think everybody's got a price. Mercer finally looked annoyed for the first time. Only briefly. Then the polished expression returned. This isn't personal, he said calmly. It's practical. Raymond looked past him toward the fields. Snowmelt dripped slowly from the grain bins beside the farmhouse. The porch light still glowed faintly despite the daylight. Eileen always changed the bulb before winter. Every year, without fail. Funny how grief lived inside ordinary details. I'm not selling, Raymond said quietly. Mercer studied him for a long moment. Then his eyes shifted toward the barn again. You know, he said casually, some people in town are curious about what's happening out here. Raymond felt something tighten inside his chest. Not fear. Warning. Mercer continued. Lights late at night. Visitors. Equipment moving around. He shrugged lightly. People notice things. Harold stepped forward immediately. You spying on the man now? No, Mercer replied smoothly. Just hearing concerns. Raymond looked carefully at him, then finally asked the question sitting underneath the conversation. What do you think's in the barn? For the first time since arriving, Mercer hesitated. Only slightly, but enough. Then he smiled again. I think old properties usually contain old records. His tone stayed light. And old records occasionally become valuable. There it was. Not land, not grain storage, not taxes. The barn. Mercer already knew something existed inside it, or suspected enough to come looking. Nora saw it too. Raymond could tell from the way she stiffened beside him. Mercer closed the folder carefully. My offer remains open, he said. But these opportunities tend to change after the new year. Then he handed Raymond a business card. On the back, handwritten in blue ink, was a single sentence. Ask about TM. Raymond looked up immediately, but Mercer had already turned away toward the SUV. Snow blew across the driveway, while the black vehicle disappeared down the county road. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Harold muttered quietly, Ray. Raymond still stared at the card. TM. The same initials from the barn records. The same initials appearing beside repairs, completed after Eileen died. Not random. Connected. And somehow connected strongly enough that a corporate land developer now wanted the barn badly enough to threaten him politely. Nora looked toward the barn doors slowly. What exactly did Mom leave us? Raymond folded the card carefully into his coat pocket, then looked out across the snow-covered fields toward the road Mercer had just taken. I think, he said quietly, somebody's afraid of it. The temperature dropped hard 2 nights later. By sunset, thin ice coated the water trough beside the machine shed, and wind pushed loose snow across the county road in silver ribbons. Raymond noticed it mostly in his hands. Cold reached the joints first now. He was tightening a loose hinge on one of the barn cabinets when his fingers stiffened badly enough that the screwdriver slipped free and clattered onto the concrete floor. You done proving you're immortal yet? Nora asked from the doorway. Raymond glanced back. She stood bundled inside her winter coat, diner apron still tied beneath it. Snow dusted her boots and shoulders. I'm working. You're freezing. Same thing most winters. Nora walked inside carrying a paper bag that smelled immediately of beef stew and fresh bread. The smell alone made the barn feel warmer. You ate lunch? She asked. Raymond did not answer quickly enough. That's what I thought. She set the food down on the workbench beside the scattered invoices and photographs. For a moment, Raymond simply watched her move around the barn. Not alien, but sometimes the resemblance caught him off guard anyway. Not in appearance. In rhythm. The quiet habit of helping, without making a performance out of it. Nora looked around the barn carefully. "You've been in here all day?" "Mostly. You find anything?" Raymond wiped his hands slowly with an old shop towel. "No, not entirely true. Earlier that afternoon, he discovered another set of initials inside the records. TM appeared beside fuel purchases, repair logs, and handwritten delivery notes stretching back nearly 8 months. Whoever TM was, Eileen trusted them, but Raymond still had not told Nora about the missing photograph, or the feeling that someone continued entering the barn after dark, not until he understood more himself. Nora studied him for another second before speaking again. "You're coming into town tonight." Raymond frowned immediately. "No." "Yes." "For what?" "Supper. I have soup. You have canned soup older than I am. That soup survived Reagan. It'll survive me too." Nora rolled her eyes. Ellie made beef stew. Raymond kept wiping the same clean wrench longer than necessary. Crowds exhausted him lately. Not physically, emotionally. People looked at widowers differently after enough time passed. Not with pity anymore. With carefulness, like grief might spread if handled incorrectly. "I don't need a restaurant," he muttered. Nora softened slightly then. "Dad," she said quietly, "you haven't sat anywhere except this trailer and this barn for almost 2 weeks." That landed harder than Raymond expected because it was true. Work. Trailer. Barn. Repeat. Like shrinking slowly without noticing. Outside, wind pushed snow against the barn walls. Finally, Raymond sighed heavily. 1 hour. Nora smiled immediately. "Look at that. Social growth. I already regret this." The diner sat just off Main Street beside the hardware store and across from the Methodist church. Ellie's Diner. Small booths. Old coffee. Pie nobody admitted coming for but everybody ordered anyway. The kind of place where waitresses knew your children's names before they learned your order. The bell above the door rang softly when Raymond stepped inside. Warmth hit him first. Then noise. Dishes clinking. Low conversation. Country music from an old radio near the kitchen. And underneath it all, life continuing. Raymond had forgotten how strange that felt. Ellie herself spotted them immediately from behind the counter. "Well," she announced loudly, "look who finally left the pasture." Several heads turned. Raymond nearly turned around and left right then, but Ellie walked straight over and hugged him before he could escape. Not dramatic. Not pitying. Just firm enough to remind a person they still existed. "You hungry?" she asked. "Apparently, I was kidnapped." "That explains the smell," Ellie said. Nora laughed beside him while guiding Raymond toward a booth near the back window. People nodded as he passed. Nothing excessive. A few quiet greetings. A hand raised from an older farmer near the coffee station. A waitress touching his shoulder briefly while refilling cups. Small-town kindness rarely arrived loudly. It accumulated. Raymond sat stiffly at first. But slowly, the tension eased. The stew helped. So did the coffee. And somewhere between Nora talking about a broken freezer at the diner and Ellie arguing with Harold near the counter about football, Raymond realized something surprising. For nearly 40 minutes, he had not thought about grief once. Not directly. Just people, voices, warm food, snow outside the windows. Life. The realization unsettled him slightly, as if healing might betray Eileen somehow. Then he remembered something she once said during chemo treatments. "Living afterward isn't betrayal, Ray. Refusing to live is." He stared quietly into his coffee after that. "You okay?" Nora asked softly. Raymond nodded once. Then the diner door opened again. Cold air swept briefly through the room. And conversation shifted almost immediately. Not silence, but attention. Daniel Mercer stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. The man looked too polished for the diner somehow. Mercer spotted Raymond instantly. Of course he did. He approached calmly between the tables. "Mr. Dalton," he said warmly. "Good evening." Raymond did not invite him to sit. Mercer remained standing anyway. "I wanted to apologize if our last conversation felt aggressive." It didn't. Mercer studied him carefully. Then his eyes drifted toward Nora. "Your wife was an extraordinary woman," he said quietly. "A lot of people respected her." Something cold moved through Raymond immediately. Because Mercer did not say knew, he said respected. Past tense. Like he knew more than he should. Mercer reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded newspaper clipping gently on the table, then stepped back, "You should ask Harold Jensen about Thomas Miller," he said. Nora stiffened beside Raymond. Me. Before Raymond could respond, Mercer smiled politely once more and walked back toward the door. The bell rang softly behind him as he disappeared into the snow. For several seconds, Raymond did not touch the newspaper clipping. Then finally he unfolded it slowly. The article was nearly 20 years old. The headline read, "Local teen dies after grain elevator accident." And beneath the headline, a photograph, Tommy Miller. Raymond read the newspaper clipping 3 times before sunrise. Tommy Miller, age 17, killed in a grain elevator accident outside Bell County. The article itself was short. Too short. A paragraph about equipment failure. A statement from the county. A funeral announcement. Then nothing. No follow-up. No details. Just a dead farm kid folded into yesterday's paper and forgotten. But Raymond remembered Tommy. Not perfectly. Memory faded around the edges now. Still, he remembered enough. The boy used to show up at the barn during winters carrying more silence than conversation. Skinny kid. Nervous hands. Always apologizing before speaking. Raymond remembered teaching him how to gap spark plugs one February afternoon while snow hammered against the roof. Tommy kept asking questions. Not because he loved engines, because he loved understanding how broken things still worked afterward. That part Raymond remembered clearly. What Raymond did not remember was the grain elevator accident, or why Eileen kept records connected to him for years afterward. By 7:30 that morning, Raymond was already inside the barn with the clipping spread across the workbench beneath the green banker's lamp. Outside, sunlight reflected sharply off melting snow, while water dripped steadily from the roofline. The barn sounded alive now. Extension cords hummed softly. The restored overhead lights buzzed faintly. Somewhere near the back wall, Harold's old space heater rattled against the cold. A week earlier, the place felt abandoned. Now it felt occupied. That mattered more than Raymond admitted aloud. He was replacing worn hydraulic lines on the Farmall tractor when Harold finally arrived carrying 2 coffees and a sack of gas station donuts. "You look terrible," Harold announced. "Morning to you too. You sleep at all?" Raymond tightened the fitting carefully before answering. "Not much." Harold noticed the newspaper clipping immediately. His expression changed. "Small, but enough." "You know him?" Raymond asked. Harold set the coffees down slowly. "Everybody knew Tommy Miller." "That's not what I asked." Harold remained quiet for several seconds. Then he sighed heavily and removed his gloves. That whole thing was ugly. Raymond waited. Harold rubbed both hands together near the heater before continuing. "Official story said Tommy died during maintenance work over at the old Ridgeway elevator. The one Mercer's company owns now?" Harold nodded once. "Used to belong to Miller Grain before they lost everything." Raymond looked back down at the article. "What really happened?" Harold's jaw tightened. "Depends who you ask." That answer irritated Raymond immediately. "Harold." The old man stared toward the barn doors. "Tommy kept saying the elevator wasn't safe," he said finally. "Said equipment was failing. Said corners were getting cut. And nobody listened to a 17-year-old kid." The heater clicked loudly in the silence afterward. Raymond looked again at Tommy's photograph. The kid's smile looked uncertain even there, like he expected the camera to apologize for bothering him. "He died alone?" Raymond asked quietly. Harold nodded slowly. "Near as anyone knows." Something about that settled heavily inside the barn. Not dramatic grief. Just wait. Raymond turned back toward the tractor mostly so Harold would not see his expression, because suddenly another memory surfaced. Tommy staying late one evening after everyone else left, sitting at the workbench while Eileen packed leftovers into foil containers. The kid asking Raymond if machines could warn people before failing. Raymond answering, "Only if somebody's paying attention." At the time, it felt like ordinary conversation. Now it didn't. Nora arrived around noon, carrying sandwiches from the diner. When Raymond showed her the article, she went unusually quiet. "What?" Raymond asked. Nora hesitated, then finally said, "Mom used to visit the Millers after Tommy died." Raymond looked up immediately. "How often?" "Alot. Why didn't you mention that before?" "I didn't think it mattered." But clearly now it did. Nora sat beside the workbench and unfolded one of the sandwiches carefully. "She brought groceries over there for months," she said quietly. "Especially after Tommy's dad started drinking." Raymond frowned slightly. "That doesn't sound like Eileen." Nora looked surprised. "Dad, that sounds exactly like Mom." And she was right. The realization came slower than it should have. Eileen never helped people loudly. She helped sideways, quietly enough that dignity survived afterward. Raymond suddenly understood something else too. The barn records were not bookkeeping. They were evidence of care. Proof that Eileen spent years connecting broken people to a man who knew how to repair things without asking too many questions. And maybe she had been repairing Raymond through them too. Outside, another truck pulled into the driveway. This time, Raymond smiled before seeing who it was. Kevin climbed out carrying a toolbox. Not expensive tools. Old ones. His own. "Well," Kevin said while entering the barn, "this place smells exactly the same." Raymond tried not to look too surprised. "You drove all the way from Ames for nostalgia?" Kevin shrugged awkwardly. Nora said the tractor's running again. Pride slipped quietly into Raymond's chest at that. Not because of the tractor, because Kevin sounded impressed despite himself. The afternoon passed differently after that. Kevin repaired wiring near the compressor. Nora cleaned and reorganized supply shelves. Harold argued with everyone about football while pretending not to help. And Raymond watched life move through the barn again. Not perfectly. Kevin still checked work emails too often. Nora still looked exhausted from double shifts. Harold still complained every 10 minutes. But the barn no longer felt like a graveyard for forgotten things. At one point, Kevin stopped beside the tractor and ran a hand along the hood. "You really got her running?" Raymond nodded once. Kevin whistled softly. "Mom would have loved that." The sentence landed unexpectedly hard. Because Kevin said it naturally. No inheritance talk. No money. Just Mom. Raymond realized then how hungry he had become for small evidence that his children still carried pieces of humanity beneath everything else. Toward evening, while reorganizing another storage cabinet, Nora discovered an old cassette player beneath a stack of manuals. "Dad," she called. Raymond looked over. Nora held up the player carefully. A cassette tape sat already inside. White label. Eileen's handwriting. "For Christmas." The entire barn seemed to go still. Harold removed his glasses slowly. Kevin stared at the tape. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Raymond stepped forward carefully and turned the cassette over in his hands. One side contained only 3 words written neatly in blue ink. "If they come back." Raymond felt cold despite the heater running nearby. Eileen had planned farther ahead than any of them realized. Not just the keys. Not just the records. Not even the cabinet. She had left something waiting specifically for the moment her family returned to the barn together. And suddenly, Raymond understood something frightening. His wife had never doubted this day would eventually happen. The question was never whether the family would come back. Only who would. The notice appeared sometime before dawn. Raymond found it nailed to the trailer door while stepping outside with his morning coffee. Bright orange paper. County seal stamped across the top. Even from several feet away, he already knew it was bad news. Nothing official ever arrived in bright colors unless somebody intended to scare you. The cold air bit sharply against his face while he pulled the paper free. Property safety review. Pending structural inspection. Below that sat several words Raymond disliked immediately. Potential condemnation. Potential seizure. Hazard liability. And finally, inspection scheduled Friday morning. 3 days away. Raymond stood motionless beneath the weak porch light while wind moved slowly across the frozen pasture. Inside the trailer, the heater rattled softly. Inside the barn, Kevin's toolbox still sat beside the workbench from yesterday. Life had just started returning to this place. Now, somebody wanted to shut it down. Again, Raymond folded the paper carefully and walked toward the barn without finishing his coffee. The sky remained dark blue with early morning frost, still silver across the fields. When he opened the barn doors, the familiar smell of oil, dust, and old wood greeted him immediately. And strangely enough, it calmed him. This place no longer felt like property, it felt like memory. The overhead lights flickered on above him while he crossed toward the workbench. The cassette tape still sat there beside the old player. For Christmas. If they come back. Raymond rested one hand against the table edge. 3 days. That was not enough time to understand what Eileen had hidden. And somehow, he knew that mattered now more than ever. By noon, Harold had already driven over after hearing about the notice from somebody at the diner. News traveled faster than weather in Bell County. Harold read the paper once and swore under his breath. "This is Mercer," he said immediately. Raymond nodded. Probably. Not directly. Men like Mercer rarely dirtied their own hands. But pressure had fingerprints, even when lawyers delivered it politely. Nora arrived next. Then Kevin. For the first time in years, the barn filled with tension instead of silence. Kevin paced near the tool cabinets, while reading the notice repeatedly. They can't just take the property. They can inspect it, Harold muttered. And if they decide the structure's unsafe, they condemn it, Nora finished quietly. Nobody spoke after that. The barn suddenly felt older around them. The roof beams, the cracked concrete, the leaning rear wall Raymond kept meaning to reinforce. For the first time since reopening the place, Raymond noticed every weakness all at once. Age did that too. One day you woke up and suddenly saw every fragile thing clearly. Kevin stopped pacing long enough to look at Raymond. You should take the offer. Silence dropped instantly. Nora stared at him. Harold looked openly irritated, but Kevin pressed forward anyway. Dad, listen to me. You can still walk away clean from this. Walk away from what? Nora snapped. Kevin threw up both hands. This, he pointed around the barn. Whatever this is turning into, Raymond studied his son carefully. Kevin looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Stress living permanently in his shoulders. Not greed. Fear. That mattered. You think I'm chasing money? Kevin asked quietly after a moment. I'm trying to keep you from getting crushed. Raymond looked toward the tractor, toward the workbench, toward Eileen's records stacked carefully beneath the lamp, then finally toward the locked filing cabinet, still hidden beneath the tarp. You know what your mother used to hate most? He asked softly. Kevin frowned slightly. She hated throwing useful things away. Nobody answered, because everyone understood he was not talking about machinery anymore. Kevin looked down at the floor. For a moment, Raymond saw the younger version of him again. The boy who rebuilt lawnmower engines at 14 because he liked making dead things work again. Somewhere along the way, adulthood had scared that part out of him. Nora moved closer to Raymond quietly. We can fix enough before Friday, she said. Harold snorted. With what time? With whatever we've got. Her voice sounded so much like Eileen in that moment that Raymond almost turned, expecting to see his wife standing beside the shelves. Steady. Practical. Refusing surrender as if it were personally offensive. The afternoon became work after that. Real work. Kevin repaired loose support brackets near the roofline. Harold reinforced the rear wall with salvaged lumber. Nora cleared decades of junk from storage corners, while Raymond inspected wiring and old foundation cracks. Nobody talked much, but movement filled the barn again. Purpose. Determination. At one point, Raymond climbed halfway up a ladder to inspect water damage near the rafters. Halfway up, dizziness hit him suddenly. Hard. The barn tilted sideways for one terrifying second. His grip slipped. Dad. Kevin caught the ladder before it tipped completely. Raymond steadied himself slowly while pain shot through his lower back. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence afterward felt different, not emotional. Afraid. Raymond climbed down carefully while Kevin kept both hands locked firmly against the ladder rails. You okay? Nora asked quietly. Raymond nodded automatically, but he was not. Not entirely, because for the first time since Eileen died, he understood something he had been avoiding. He might not have enough time left to finish whatever she started. That realization frightened him more than Mercer, more than the county, more than losing the land. Later, near sunset, Kevin stepped outside to smoke near the truck, while Harold gathered tools beside the heater. Inside the barn, Nora approached Raymond carefully. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, she said softly. Raymond looked toward her, then toward the others outside. Kevin laughing weakly at something Harold said. Snow melting from truck tires. Warm light spilling from the barn doors into the darkening pasture. For one brief moment, the place looked alive enough to survive. Then Raymond noticed something attached to the outside barn door. Another piece of paper. White this time, folded neatly. No county seal. No name. Just 4 handwritten words. He should have stayed quiet. Raymond unfolded the paper fully. Beneath the message sat an old photograph of Tommy Miller standing beside the Ridgeway grain elevator, and someone had drawn a black line through his face. The inspection arrived Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. 2 county trucks rolled onto the property beneath a gray winter sky while frost still clung to the fence posts. Raymond watched from the barn doorway with both hands buried deep inside his coat pockets. He barely slept. Not after the photograph. Not after the warning. He should have stayed quiet. Those 4 words stayed inside Raymond's head all night long like something unfinished. Beside him, Nora stood silently holding a clipboard full of repair notes Kevin insisted they keep to look official. Harold leaned against the workbench drinking coffee from a thermos. Kevin paced near the tractor, pretending not to be nervous. And beneath the tarp at the back of the barn sat the locked filing cabinet Eileen marked, "Not until Christmas." Raymond looked at it again, then toward the county trucks, then back at the cabinet. Something settled inside him quietly. Enough waiting. Before the inspectors even reached the barn, Raymond crossed the concrete floor toward the tarp. "Dad?" Nora asked carefully. Raymond did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled the tarp fully aside. Dust rose softly through the cold air. The steel cabinet looked older in daylight, stronger somehow, like it had been waiting longer than the rest of them. Raymond removed the brass key from his coat pocket. The original one. Alien's key. "It's not Christmas," Kevin said cautiously. "No," Raymond replied quietly, "but somebody's trying real hard to make sure we never get there." Then he unlocked the top drawer. The metal clicked loudly inside the silent barn, and suddenly everyone stopped moving, even Harold. Inside, the drawer sat dozens of folders arranged alphabetically. Miller, Reese, Peterson, Walker, Hayes. Families Raymond recognized from 30 years of farming life across Bell County. Nora opened the nearest folder carefully. Her eyes widened immediately. "These are complaints." Raymond stepped closer. "Inspection reports. Methanol slug. Photographs. Signed statements. Everything connected to Ridgeway Grain Elevator, dating back over 20 years. Kevin picked up another folder. "Jesus," he muttered softly. Raymond read quickly now. Faulty safety systems. Ignored repair warnings. Broken emergency shutoffs. Workers reporting dangerous equipment conditions months before Tommy Miller died. And underneath every report, the same corporate name. Heartland Ag Expansion Group. Mercer's company. The heater rattled loudly in the silence that followed. Then Harold sat down heavily on the nearby stool. "That son of a bitch," he whispered. Raymond kept reading. The deeper he went, the worse it became. Tommy Miller had repeatedly filed maintenance warnings after discovering unstable grain conveyor equipment inside the elevator. Management ignored him, then reassigned him, then threatened termination. 3 weeks later, Tommy died during a nighttime equipment failure officially labeled an accident. But inside the cabinet sat photographs proving otherwise. Safety locks removed. Warning systems disconnected. Inspection dates altered. And one thing worse than all of it, a signed witness statement. Thomas Miller reported unsafe conditions directly to Regional Supervisor Daniel Mercer 14 days before incident occurred. Raymond stopped breathing for a moment. Mercer knew. Not suspected. Knew. Nora covered her mouth slowly while reading another report. "Mom had all this?" Raymond nodded numbly. "Not just this. There was more." The second drawer contained correspondence between Eileen and multiple families affected by Ridgeway accidents over the years. Quiet settlements, medical bills, disappearance of reports, county inspectors suddenly changing conclusions, people pressured into silence, and tucked beneath all of it sat a cassette tape case. Same handwriting. "Play this first." Raymond looked toward the old cassette player on the workbench. Nobody spoke while he inserted the tape. The machine clicked softly. Static filled the barn. Then Eileen's voice emerged. Older, tired, but steady. "Ray," she said gently, "if you're hearing this, then you finally stopped running from hard conversations." Nora immediately looked down. Kevin turned away toward the tractor. Harold removed his glasses slowly. On the tape, Eileen continued. "Tommy Miller came to the barn 3 nights before he died." Raymond felt cold move through his chest. "He was scared," Eileen said. "Not for himself, for his parents. He thought if he pushed too hard about the elevator, they'd lose everything." Static crackled softly. "He gave me copies of records because he trusted you, Ray. Said you were the only man in town who still fixed things because they were broken instead of because it was profitable." Raymond shut his eyes. Memory returned suddenly. Tommy sitting at the workbench late one snowy evening, asking strange questions, looking over his shoulder constantly. At the time, Raymond assumed the boy was nervous. He had no idea Tommy was afraid. Eileen's voice softened further. "After Tommy died, Mercer tried to make the records disappear, but people talk in small towns, especially grieving mothers." Nora quietly wiped tears from her face. The tape continued. "I kept everything because someday somebody needed to tell the truth." A long pause followed. Then, But the truth wasn't the only thing I was protecting. Raymond opened his eyes slowly. Static hissed softly through the speakers. Then Eileen laughed gently. The sound hit Raymond harder than anything else so far. "You spent your whole life believing your value came from what you could provide," she said. "But Tommy wasn't the only broken thing people brought to this barn." Raymond lowered himself slowly onto the stool near the workbench. Around him, the barn felt impossibly still. "You gave people dignity," Eileen continued. "You gave scared boys confidence. You gave tired farmers hope. You gave people a place where failure didn't make them disposable." Kevin looked toward his father then. Really looked. "For the first time in years, and after I got sick," Eileen said softly, "this barn became the last good thing I knew would survive me." Silence swallowed the room after the tape stopped. Nobody moved. Outside, truck doors slammed near the driveway. The inspectors had arrived. But inside the barn, something larger had already changed. Raymond stared at the rows of folders surrounding him. The photographs, the witness statements, the records, the invoices, the repaired machines, the people. All those years, Raymond thought he was simply fixing equipment. But Eileen saw the truth long before he did. He had built a refuge without realizing it. Not for tractors. For people. Then Kevin spoke quietly from near the tractor. "Dad." Raymond looked up. Kevin's eyes were wet. "I think Mom turned this place into proof." The barn doors opened suddenly. Cold air rushed inside as 2 county inspectors entered carrying clipboards. But neither Raymond nor the others looked frightened anymore, because now they understood why Mercer wanted the barn destroyed before Christmas. Not because of the land, because inside this building sat 20 years of evidence. And inside those records lived the truth about Tommy Miller. A truth somebody had already killed once to bury. The county inspection lasted less than 20 minutes. That alone told Raymond something had changed. 3 days earlier, he was just an aging farmer living in a trailer beside a deteriorating barn. Now he stood surrounded by witness statements, maintenance records, signed reports, and 2 children who looked ready to fight for the place beside him. The inspectors moved slowly through the building, while Nora handed over repair notes, and Kevin answered structural questions with surprising confidence. Harold followed them the entire time like an irritated watchdog. "You miss one loose board, and suddenly everybody becomes an engineer," he muttered. One inspector almost smiled. Almost. Raymond stayed near the workbench beside Eileen's folders. Not guarding them, just close. The younger inspector finally approached him near the end. "These records," the man said carefully. "Where exactly did they come from?" "My wife." The inspector nodded once while glancing toward the stacked files. Then his expression shifted subtly after spotting the Heartland Ag logo repeated across several reports. "You may want legal counsel involved before turning these over," he said quietly. Not denial, not dismissal. Warning. That mattered. Outside, word had already begun spreading through town before the county trucks even left the property. Bell County functioned like weather in winter. Once something started moving, everybody felt it eventually. By afternoon, the first unexpected visitor arrived. Then another. Then 3 more. Raymond stood near the barn entrance, watching a dusty blue pickup roll slowly onto the property. A woman stepped out carrying a casserole dish wrapped in towels. Older than Raymond by a few years. Gray coat, nervous expression. The moment she saw him, her eyes filled immediately. "Mrs. Miller," Raymond said softly. Tommy's mother nodded once. For a second, neither moved. Then she crossed the gravel quickly and hugged him before he could prepare for it. Not politely, not carefully, like someone holding on to 20 years of grief all at once. "I always wondered," she whispered shakily, "if somebody else knew." Raymond shut his eyes briefly. Behind them, Nora quietly stepped back to give space. Mrs. Miller pulled away slowly and handed Raymond the casserole dish. "He talked about this barn constantly," she said with a watery laugh. "Said it smelled like oil and coffee and second chances." The sentence hit Raymond directly in the chest, because it sounded exactly like Tommy. Quiet, observant, trying to describe comfort without admitting he needed it. Within another hour, more vehicles arrived. Farmers, vidos, mechanics, people Raymond recognized immediately, and others he barely remembered. One man brought replacement lumber. Another delivered old heaters for the barn. A younger couple arrived carrying boxes of tools. Nobody announced why they came. They simply started helping. Kevin stood near the workbench, watching all of it unfold with stunned disbelief. "You knew these people?" he asked quietly. Raymond looked around the barn. "No," he answered honestly. "Your mother did." But slowly, he realized that was not completely true anymore. A middle-aged farmer near the tractor shook Raymond's hand firmly. "You rebuilt my transmission in 2011, he said. "Wouldn't let me pay after my brother died." Another man pointed toward the shelves. "You stayed overnight fixing our combine during harvest season." An older woman near the heater smiled softly. "My husband talked about you for years after you repaired his truck." Raymond barely remembered half these moments, but Eileen remembered all of them. That realization settled warmly inside him now, instead of painfully. The barn kept filling through the afternoon, not crowded, alive. The sound of hammers returned. Voices, laughter, coffee brewing somewhere near the back wall. At one point, Nora stopped beside Raymond holding another box of donated supplies. "You see it now?" she asked quietly. "See what?" "Why Mom protected this place." Raymond looked across the barn. Kevin helping reinforce shelves beside Harold. Mrs. Miller speaking softly with Nora near the workbench. 3 local farmers repairing cracked siding without being asked. For years, Raymond thought Eileen preserved evidence. But evidence alone would not make people drive through snow carrying casseroles and toolboxes. No, she preserved connection. The realization nearly broke him in the gentlest possible way. Near sunset, another vehicle appeared at the end of the driveway. Black SUV. Conversation inside the barn softened immediately. Mercer stepped out slowly. No smile this time. No polished confidence either. Just controlled tension. Raymond walked toward the open barn doors before anybody else could. Mercer stopped several feet away. Snow drifted lightly between them. "You've made this unnecessarily public," Mercer said carefully. Raymond almost laughed. "Public. As if truth itself had become inconvenient. You threatened my family." Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. "I warned you there were consequences." "No," Raymond said quietly. "You warned Tommy Miller." For the first time since arriving in Bell County, Daniel Mercer looked uncertain. Only briefly, but Raymond saw it. And suddenly he understood something important. Men like Mercer depended on isolation. Silence. Private fear. That was why the barn mattered so much now. Not because Raymond finally discovered the truth. Because the truth was no longer lonely. Behind Raymond, more people continued entering the barn, carrying supplies and coffee and winter coats. Community. Witnesses. Mercer noticed them too. The black SUV suddenly looked much smaller parked beside the pasture. "You should think carefully before escalating this," Mercer said quietly. Raymond looked back toward the barn one more time. Warm light spilled across the snow through the open doors. Inside, Kevin laughed unexpectedly at something Harold said. Mrs. Miller stood beside the tractor wiping tears while smiling at the photographs. And Nora. Nora had already switched on the farmhouse porch light across the field before darkness settled, just like Eileen used to do. Raymond turned back toward Mercer calmly. "You know," he said softly, "for a long time I thought losing money was the worst thing that could happen to a man." Mercer remained silent. Raymond glanced once more toward the people inside the barn. "Turns out," he said, "it's believing nobody would come if you lost it." Then he stepped back inside the barn and closed the doors, leaving Mercer alone outside in the falling snow. By Christmas Eve, the barn no longer sounded empty. That was the first thing Raymond noticed. Not how it looked, how it sounded. Boots crossing the concrete floor, coffee brewing near the heater, tools clinking against workbenches, voices carrying through old rafters that had spent too many years holding silence instead. Outside, fresh snow covered the pasture in smooth white layers beneath a pale winter sky. Inside, warmth finally held. Not perfectly. The rear wall still leaned slightly. The roof still complained during heavy wind. And the old Farmall tractor leaked oil whenever the temperature dropped below freezing. But the barn lived again. Raymond stood near the open doors watching Harold argue with Kevin over wiring, while Nora hung strands of white lights along one wall for the Christmas gathering later that evening. "You missed a spot," Harold grumbled. Kevin rolled his eyes. "You've said that 6 times. Because you keep missing spots." Nora laughed softly from the ladder. The sound drifted naturally through the barn now. Not forced. Not fragile. Just part of the place. Raymond rested one hand against the workbench and allowed himself a long moment simply to watch. For years he thought providing meant building things people depended on. Land. equipment, savings, but Eileen understood something he did not. People stayed because of how a place made them feel. Safe, useful, sane. That was what survived, not the money. The week after the county inspection changed everything. Mrs. Miller turned over copies of Tommy's original letters to a local attorney. Former Ridgeway workers started speaking publicly. 2 retired inspectors admitted maintenance reports had been altered years earlier under corporate pressure. And Daniel Mercer stopped coming to the property entirely after state investigators arrived in Bell County. The lawsuits would take years. Raymond understood that. But for the first time in decades, the truth no longer belonged to whispers. It belonged to daylight. Nora stepped down from the ladder carrying a box of decorations. "You okay?" she asked. Raymond nodded once. Then after a moment added, "Your mother would have hated those lights." Nora laughed immediately. She absolutely would have. Too flashy. She'd call them tacky, then secretly leave them up until February. Nora smiled at that. And suddenly Raymond realized something important. For the first time since Eileen died, remembering her no longer felt like falling. It felt like carrying. The realization settled quietly inside him while evening approached. By 6 o'clock, trucks lined the driveway all the way to the county road. Neighbors filled the barn carrying food trays, folding chairs, pies, crockpots, toolboxes, children, stories, and enough winter coats to survive another Iowa blizzard. Nobody called it a celebration, but that was what it became anyway. The old cassette player sat near the workbench now. Beside it rested photographs of Tommy Miller, Eileen, and dozens of families whose names filled the repair records. Near the entrance, Kevin mounted a wooden sign above the shelves earlier that afternoon. The things Ray fixed. Raymond protested immediately when he saw it, then grew suspiciously quiet afterward. Harold noticed. "Don't worry," he muttered. "We all know you hate sentiment. I do hate sentiment." "Good," Harold said. "Means your wife finally won." That earned the loudest laugh Raymond had produced in over a year. Real laughter. Deep enough to surprise him. Later that evening, snow began falling again outside the barn doors while people gathered near the heater drinking coffee from paper cups. Mrs. Miller approached Raymond carrying something wrapped carefully in cloth. "I think Tommy wanted you to have this," she said softly. Inside rested an old spark plug gauge, worn smooth from years of use. Raymond recognized it immediately. He gave it to Tommy during one of those winter repair nights long ago. "You kept this?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Miller smiled through tears. He carried it everywhere. For several seconds Raymond could not speak, because suddenly he understood why Eileen saved all the records. Not for revenge, not even for justice alone. She preserved proof that kindness mattered after the moment itself passed. That people carried small acts longer than anyone realized. Outside, children ran laughing between parked trucks while snow covered the pasture deeper in white. Inside, Nora moved through the crowd refilling coffee cups exactly the way Eileen used to. Kevin repaired a loose chair leg for one of the older farmers without even thinking about it. And Harold secretly fixed the broken barn heater while loudly complaining the entire time. Some things never changed. Near the end of the night, Raymond finally stepped outside alone for air. Cold wrapped around him immediately. The farmhouse stood across the field, glowing warmly against the dark. And there, just like every evening before sunset, the porch light burned. Raymond stared at it for a long time, then slowly crossed the pasture toward the house. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Inside the farmhouse, everything looked smaller than he remembered. Not sad, just quieter. The kitchen still held Eileen's recipe box near the counter. Her reading glasses still rested beside the old calendar no one changed after July. And above the sink, the porch light switch remained flipped upward, exactly where Nora left it earlier. Raymond touched the switch gently with 2 fingers, then looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. Warm light spilled through the distant doors across the snow-covered pasture. People still moved inside, laughing, talking, living. The place Eileen protected survived, not because Raymond saved it alone, because people came back. A soft knock sounded behind him. Raymond turned. Nora stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You disappeared," she said. Raymond accepted the mug carefully. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nora looked toward the glowing barn outside and smiled faintly. "You know," she said quietly, "Mom always said you never understood how many people loved you." Raymond looked out toward the barn again, toward the lights. toward the life still moving inside it. Then he smiled softly for the first time without grief hiding underneath it. "Yeah," he said, "I think I'm finally starting to fix that." And outside, across the frozen pasture, the porch light continued burning warmly through the snow.